Warwick Powell, welcome to BRI Dialogues. We're delighted to have you on our program as our season finale. This is basically the last episode of 2024, and the world has changed a great deal. But before jumping into the questions, I wanted to quickly introduce you to our audience, though a lot of them have heard and know about you, but for those who may not be familiar with your stellar track record. Warwick Powell is an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology in Australia, senior fellow at Taihe Institute in Beijing. Additionally, Warwick is the chairman and founder of Sister City Partners Limited, a not-for-profit investment bank focusing on developing links between regional Australia and markets of Asia. Warwick focuses on China, and that's an understatement, regional economic development, digital technologies, and global political economy and governance. He has a wonderful book out, highly recommended, China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World, which subject that we will focus on. Warwick also has a fantastic Substack that I think it's like a lighthouse in choppy waters of trade between the Northern and Southern Hemisphere, and highly recommended. And I want to kick off, Warwick, with one question, and that is this development of mBridge and how mBridge came about between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, People's Bank of China, Central Bank of UAE, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia. But the most interesting element of mBridge, perhaps, and the latest development, is this announcement of China issuing US dollar bonds in Saudi Arabia, which were oversubscribed by 20 times, 40 billion over 2 billion. And what does this tell us about the new monetary architecture? Where are we going? And is this a shot across the bow of Trump administration coming to the office by China saying, hey, I can issue US dollar bonds as well? And guess where? In a petrostate, part of soon-to-be BRICS Plus. Can you paint a picture of this tectonic shift in and around this latest development and a bit of insight with your par excellence insight into the mBridge and where are we going?
Well, great to be with you both. Let's see how we go. There are two quite large topics that you've asked about, of course. One is the mBridge project, which, as you mentioned, has been a project created by a consortium of central banks revolving around originally the Bank of International Settlements. And it was a project that kickstarted in 2021 with the participation of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, People's Bank of China, Central Bank of Thailand, and the Central Bank of the UAE, together with the BIS, and a fairly large network of observer banks and related institutions. Somewhere in the order of 30 other central banks were observers in the project. In the last 6 months or so, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia has also lifted its status from being an observer participant to being a full participant. The project emerged 3 or so years ago, largely in response to problems that central banks had articulated for a long time, actually, with the prevailing financial settlements architecture, the bank-to-bank settlements architecture that has been operational for many decades. And the concerns were principally that the existing systems, anchored by SWIFT as a messaging protocol between banks, and the ways in which ledger adjustments were made between participating banks globally, was slow and expensive. That was really the starting point of the project, that there had to be better ways making use of various forms of technologies. And the project really started as a research and development initiative aiming to explore what a future payment system could look like that made use of new technologies, particularly distributed ledger technologies, to enable faster and lower cost settlements between the central banks. There was an additional benefit of using distributed ledger technologies, and that is that it mitigated the risk that the system could be capriciously controlled or subject to interference by a single party. So a distributed ledger involving the participating banks, not the observer banks, but the actual participating banks, each running a node in the distributed computer network, would operate this information network as a collective responsibility, so that no single participant could change the ledger or prohibit others from making adjustments to the ledger subject to agreements between transacting parties. And of course, what that meant was that the ledger, in effect, was censorship proof and sanctions proof. So cheaper, quicker, more secure. That was the project's origins. It evolved to a point where in 2022, trials were done, real transfers of value. 2023 was a year of fairly significant network upgrading. So the consensus algorithm was basically rebuilt to enable it to operate faster again. And by May, June 2024, a minimum viable product was released. And that minimum viable product is now in use by the participating central banks and a small number of commercial banks that hold accounts with those central banks. In other words, the system is now up and running and is live. So that's where mBridge is at. It's not huge in terms of volume terms, but it has shown a way in which new technologies can be harnessed to address those three fundamental challenges that cross-border settlements has confronted for a number of years. The other dimension of the mBridge project is actually the non-technical dimension, which I think is quite interesting and important. And that goes to the ways in which participation is governed and how the participating banks are collectively responsible for approving any changes to the algorithms and the deployment of any upgrades to the system. So once again, the operational governance objective is to mitigate the risk of single actors capriciously making changes to the operating system, so to speak. So that's mBridge. The issue of the bonds, I think, is a fascinating one because it's obviously drawn an incredible amount of interest around the world. And I think that there's a few things we can say about it. Firstly, it's actually not the first time that China has issued US dollar bonds. It has done so prior to 2019, and it did that in Hong Kong. The fact that it has issued them for the first time out of Riyadh is probably the first sort of interesting point. The second interesting feature about this offer is that it's actually relatively small. It's $2 billion. And in the global scheme of the US bonds market, it's barely a drop in the ocean. The global US bonds market is valued at about $46 trillion. So that's $46,000 billion. And China's own US dollar reserves is estimated to be in the order of $5 to $6 trillion. Annually, the bonds market is expected to grow in net terms by $2 trillion. So a $2 billion issuance in the global scheme of things is relatively minor. Now, what are we to make of that? Well, I think the first thing we can say about it is that in and of itself, this does not represent a turning on its head of the global financial system or the US financial system. What it does say, though, is that the project is aimed at really being a tester project. Right? You don't have to do anything particularly big for it to be a meaningful learning experiment. And that learning experiment has a few interesting parts. One was, of course, just to see what the market was like, and clearly there is strong demand. Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that it shows is that the opportunity exists for China to raise US dollar bonds and for those US dollars to be deployed in very specific ways. Now, much of the speculation or conjecture has talked about how those US dollars could be used to assist developing countries with dollar-denominated debt repayments. But at $2 billion, this is, unlikely to be meaningful. But it does provide a starting point. So the funds could, of course, in theory, be provided for that purpose. But I suspect that its first principal purpose is to provide liquidity for projects in Saudi Arabia that will be delivered actually by Chinese firms in particular. And the reason why I say that is that the bonds themselves are dual listed on a Chinese exchange as well as the exchange in Riyadh itself. And to me, that institutional configuration is probably the most significant part of this story because it represents an important step forward off the back of agreements reached in 2023 between Xi Jinping and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia concerning interoperability and alignment of financial institutions, regulations and rules governing capital market interoperability. And secondly, by doing this, it again opens out an experimental opportunity to better understand what the issues, the opportunities and challenges are for investors, retail investors and institutional investors trading these instruments will likely do in both Riyadh and in China itself. So at $2 billion, it's actually very, very small, but it does suggest that the issuers and their partners are looking at this as a learning project as much as anything else. Is it a shot across the bow? Well, if it is, it's a relatively small shot. So I'm not sure that will in and of itself be a source of any great concern to anybody really. But at the same time, I think the concern, if you will, would be that Saudi Arabia and the projects that it's rolling out will actually be able to gain funding support, liquidity support from a non-American source.
Yeah, Warwick, absolutely amazing analysis you provided. Thank you. I have a question about mBridge that is a bit left field, and that is, how does that actually help corporations rather than central banks? But that's an ignorant person's question. Sure. The other question, though, is about BRICS Plus. First, about their kind of struggles for monetary unity, for want of a better term. But the elephant in the room is the new administration in Washington, and we've talked about bonds. We've all woken up to the news that Trump is going to impose sanctions, tariffs, that is, on the three major trading partners of the United States, Canada, Mexico, and China. How will this kind of even talk of it, let alone the actual application of such tariffs, affect the calculations of those who hold US dollars, and particularly the bond market that you've unpacked for us so beautifully?
All right, let's see if I've got the questions. The first one goes to how mBridge affects enterprises as opposed to banks, central banks. The second one, or the third question, I think, related to the tariffs, and there was a middle question. Just refresh my memory on that.
The BRICS Plus struggle for want of a better term, monetary union. Let's go.
Warwick, it's always playing dodgeball with him, but he throws three balls at the same time. So
okay. And normally I would be a little bit more keyed in because I actually like to also almost visualize dot points. And that way I can hopefully order things and tick them off. Look, mBridge is a bank-to-bank architecture for central bank to central bank settlements. Central banks then have relationships with commercial banks. So commercial banks have accounts at central banks, and the commercial banks operate accounts for enterprises. So that's the hierarchy of balance sheets that actually exists in the financial architecture. So enterprises have accounts at commercial banks, and then commercial banks have accounts at central banks, and then central banks settle with each other for cross-border transactions. So mBridge directly is not an infrastructure that enables commercial banks to transact directly with commercial banks. So in that sense, it does not have a direct peer-to-peer capability. Its relevance for enterprises is that it enables rapid settlement of accounts between the respective central banks, and therefore the accounts that enterprises have with their respective commercial banks will be adjusted quickly and at low cost. So when the infrastructure is low cost, the transacting parties, particularly the enterprises engaging in cross-border trade, will not be hit with high transaction fees. So that's how these systems benefit enterprises. The issue of BRICS Plus and the unfolding what I think they call the complementary financial architecture really revolves around a few key parts. One is, of course, an independent settlements architecture, which in some ways I think will draw a lot from the mBridge design lessons. So, and both in the technical sense and also in terms of that broader governance sense. The experiences of mBridge, which I described earlier, really, I think, provides BRICS Plus countries with an incredible amount of learnings as to how multiple central banks can come together to design and operate a payments platform that they all have an equal and shared responsibility in, and how adjustments to the infrastructure, the rules governing that particular operating ecosystem, are then rolled out and impact how participants get involved. So there's a lot to be learned from the mBridge project, which I'm sure will in due course find its way into the actual design and implementation of a BRICS settlement system. The second thing that I think is interesting about the BRICS settlements system is there is an explicit recognition that there needs to be an insurance component to support the management of risks in cross-border settlements. So a distinct and unique insurance architecture will be developed in parallel to the settlements architecture. The third thing in the BRICS arrangements goes to the issue of liquidity and how that will work for the participating institutions. So that is to ensure that the participating institutions have sufficient reserves of the respective national currencies, because bear in mind, this is a national currency-based trading system, to be able to settle their bills when they become due. And the BRICS Kazan Declaration actually was quite clear that they will expand the swap arrangements that are already in place, but which need to be expanded to fulfill a greater role, and that will be operated through an expanded role for the new development bank. In effect, it's going to run a parallel system or a complementary system to what the IMF does as far as providing liquidity for bank-to-bank settlements in the existing architecture. The last piece really goes to the ways in which the system determines the equivalences between the national currencies. So this is the question of the exchange rate and how that is to be managed. And I suspect when you read through the lines of the Kazan settlement and also the discussion paper that was released beforehand, that the design intent is going to be something along the lines or something inspired by the way that Keynes described the Bancor in the early 1940s. So it would be essentially a settlement currency, not a BRICS currency, not a retail currency, but a settlement currency that would act as a numeraire, so the common denominator for all the other national currencies. The interesting question will be whether or not, as part of this design process, a set of rules will be instituted that will affect the incentives for different countries to accumulate the settlement instrument. The imbalances that exist in the post-Bretton Woods world, the post-World War II world, have in part taken place because there are strong incentives for nations to accumulate surpluses, and very, very few incentives for those surpluses to then be deployed into deficit nations to expand their productive capabilities. Now, Keynes was well and truly aware of this in the early 1940s, that you need to bake in to a settlement system a set of incentives and disincentives that are fair, that not only impact creditor nations, but also impact debtor nations and vice versa. The world as we have today basically requires debtor nations to make the adjustments. And the consequences of that has seen many debtor nations go into serious debt crises in US dollar, with the IMF being central to that, but also private loans, and get into incredible trouble because those countries actually have no way out of that particular debt spiral. They owe money in a currency that they actually have no control of and that they do not mint. And that environment of uneven development consolidated through a financial architecture that gives zero incentives for creditor nations to invest those surplus funds into debtor nations needs to change, and how that manifests itself through this next 12 months as BRICS Plus works its way through the settlement system, I think will be a very interesting and important point, because clearly across the BRICS network, there are some imbalances in trade. Now, imbalances in and of themselves at any moment in time is just a snapshot. And the real issue is what the dynamics are over time. You know, you're not trying to create a system that creates constant balance, you know, at every moment in time. What you're trying to do is to ensure a system that recognises that some countries will, from time to time, produce more of some things that others want or need, and vice versa, and that therefore you'll end up with some surpluses and some deficits. The pivotal question is how the surplus nations eventually commit to developing the capabilities in the debtor nations to help them alleviate the imbalances that exist. Now, I think we have some hints as to the willingness of the creditor nations to begin doing some of that. And I say hints because these are early days, but China, which is a significant trade surplus nation, a creditor nation, is now emerging as a significant exporter of capital itself. And it's doing that by building factories and assembly facilities in a whole range of countries, and progressively enabling those countries to have their own value-adding capabilities. So I think that there are some hints that this is a pathway that the BRICS nations, and China in particular, is open to. They're certainly cognizant of the issues. I believe that they are also very mindful that the whole point of the BRICS financial architecture design is not to create a parallel but identical system, but it's to actually address the problems that have been very well articulated in the BRICS financial discussion paper, which is around these imbalances and these issues. So I think that there is a recognition that these are the challenges, that the system design must address these challenges. So it's not about replacing the US dollar with something else, but essentially leaving the system unchanged. It's actually about changing the way the system works. Now, tariffs is the last question. Tariffs was the last one, right? Look, I'll be very brief on it. We can explore it a little bit more if we want, but tariffs fundamentally, of course, are aimed at reducing the amount of imports to the United States on the basis that it's the US imposing the tariffs by increasing the costs of them in the United States market. Now, if you do that, then there'll be fewer US dollars ultimately spent buying those goods. And so there will actually be fewer US dollars being injected into the global network through the importation of products manufactured elsewhere. Now, I'm not sure how that situation helps create demand for the US dollar.
Fantastic. In your book, you have a chapter on monetary evolution, digital currency circuits, and capital accumulation and supply chain finance. And when I look at the word chain, supply chain and blockchain, and very few people have looked at decentralized finance and digital currencies, I wanted to ask you two questions. Anush asked three, so I'm asking two. And that is, one is the issue of trust. All of this sounds great. Very few people have been able to answer and help us and our audience, but I'm sure you can. As it stands, still the global architecture and grid of fiber optics, telecom, IT is a legacy model that is very much interdependent on US and European infrastructure. So if denial of access comes tomorrow to mBridge or to the global south for their multi-currency basket, that I'm sorry, everything still has to pass through New York. It was the dollar, but if it's going through my telecom infrastructure as well, not on my watch. That's number one. The second question I have for you is that, do you find the Western Hemisphere or the global North being preoccupied as a financialized system, so constantly creating financial products and barriers rather than producing innovations and patents? The latest one is the homegrown OS of Huawei, which is making the news of the handset in the past 48 hours. Are we teetering as well on also a parallel infrastructure of digital infrastructure that would allow these new monetary architectures and pipings to work together?
Yep.
And what do you think is that outcome going to look like?
Look, in some of my writings, I've talked about this idea of a digital Westphalia as an important element of a multinodal world. And by that, I mean a digital architecture that has a common operating system, but one in which nation states can exert their own sovereign control over the particular ways in which they interact with that digital ecology. And that goes to both software as well as hardware. As you noted, much of the digital infrastructure in the world today, meaning the terrestrial networks, the undersea cables, and the satellite networks, together with the data centers that actually process all of this information, much of that has been controlled by the collective West, and in particular the United States. Around 60% of global internet traffic actually flows through the data centers in Virginia, in North America. And that's been well articulated in a book called Underground Empire, and written by some American political scientists who I think were a little bit surprised at the extent to which the United States government, through its regulatory reach into the information technology industry, the pipes, if you will, the information pipes, can actually intercept messages from anywhere around the world and exert jurisdiction over much of that on the basis that something goes through the data centers in Virginia. Now, to get away from that, to reduce your risk of being in effect censored, you need to have an infrastructure that no single party can exercise that kind of authority over. Now, this goes to this question of trust and what trust means. Trust actually has many meanings, and the word in some respects has contradictory meanings, which makes it quite an unhelpful word when we want to talk about the way information works and the way in which parties relate to each other. Trust in a day-to-day sense involves or describes a relationship that, in effect, two people have with each other. And that relationship involves a willingness on one party to render themselves exposed and vulnerable to another party. That's a relationship of trust, because when you render yourself vulnerable to another party, you believe that you won't be adversely affected by that. That's trust. So that's one way of understanding trust. In a security environment and an information environment, trust is at best a 5-letter word, but is actually at worst something to be avoided. And it's to be avoided because of the way that we understand what trust is, as I described it just before. And that is to be vulnerable to the capricious decisions of a single other. So in other words, whenever you have a relationship of trust, it means that one of the parties is actually in a very significantly dominant position in relation to whatever it is that the relationship has at stake. So when parties are relating to each other, the world is actually a fairer world when the architecture enables what I call a zero trust relationship. And a zero trust relationship isn't a trustless relationship, and it's not a I don't trust somebody else relationship in the human sense, but it's one in which we displace concerns about trust in terms of vulnerability by a different set of concerns, which is about dependability. So when countries relate to each other and enterprises relate to each other and banks relate to each other, the critical issue here is to actually not be exposed to the risk of trust, because that's when the other side can capriciously do something that could harm you, but to have an environment in which there is no such risk, or that risk is incredibly small, which means creating a trustless environment. And a trustless environment is one in which multiple parties are collectively responsible for certain things, but no single party can act capriciously, of their own will, unpredictably.
Right.
And so the aim of for instance, distributed ledger technologies is to create an information architecture that reduces the extent to which individual parties are exposed to harm through the actions of others in relation to the information that they all rely upon. And that kind of approach becomes very important in complex supply chains where, in fact, the business transactions involving the actors, once the system's up and running in particular, are largely relationships between strangers. It involves the movement of paper and information between actors who may never have met each other and actually don't have the kind of interpersonal relationships that you need for there to be trust in that human sense. So enterprises, when they transact with each other, are moving documents concerning consignments, insurance verification certificates, and other forms of provenance certifications and declarations, health certificates, halal certifications in the event that matters, organic certification if that matters, declarations concerning woody materials, diseases, etc., etc. Now, all of those informational claims need to be done in a system that is dependable,
Mm.
because the person at the other end, whether it's a customs officer reviewing the documentation that comes with the consignment, or a banker reviewing what you'd call is the letters of credit and associated documents, they don't know the person on the other side. They've never met the CFO. They've never met the export manager. It doesn't matter. What they need is an information system that transcends interpersonal trust. So that's actually what, in many regards, China is building in terms of its own approach to distributed ledgers and the use of blockchains. And as we've discussed already, we're starting to see that emerge in mainstream cross-border banking through projects like mBridge. That's where it's heading to. So that's the question of trust, the dominance historically of American firms in relation to hardware and software, and ultimately the kind of ecosystem that needs to be developed and emerged so that no single actor can prohibit other actors from being involved so long as they participate in accordance with the rules, and that no single actor can modify information capriciously in ways that are also non-compliant with the agreed rules of the game.
Yeah. Extraordinary unpacking of this, Warwick. Thank you so much. Fascinating. The first time I've heard it explained so clearly, these notions, very sophisticated interactions between people, corporations, states, and communities. So wonderful. I'm going to take you somewhere else for my question. You may be following that the new government, Labour government in Britain, is playing catch up with the rest of Europe in restoring closer ties with China. Our foreign secretary was there. The chancellor is due to go, and at some point the prime minister will end up in Beijing as well. And you know, they had a bit of a chat at G20 down in Rio. In any case, do you sense that there is a greater degree of urgency in Europe as a whole in trying to rebuild this kind of fraying bridges with China in anticipation of the economic pressures that are going to come from the United States? Or do you think that this is inevitable for Eurasia to become this dominant economic landmass in due course?
I think Western Europe, of course, is facing a series of challenges that require it to think very seriously about how it goes forward. The fundamental strategic question for Western Europe, both collectively through a body such as the European Union and the European Commission, or as individual nation states, is whether or not they essentially become a rump of a transatlantic power, or whether they become a Western bulwark of a consolidated Eurasian economic landmass. That's your big picture strategic question. I think in many regards, the powers that be, so not the populations per se, but the powers that be in Brussels, have for a number of years tended to be drawn towards the idea of being a part of a transatlantic economic power bloc. That, however, the approach on that front has been fundamentally, I think, undermined. Undermined in part because the energy shocks occasioned by policy decisions after Russia's invasion of Ukraine has catalyzed and hastened the deindustrialization of much of the Western European economic landscape. And that, of course, has significant social reverberations. The second thing, of course, is the risk from Europe's point of view that the United States will be less interested in being a security guarantor and will, in fact, pursue economic policies that are likely to continue stripping out or hollowing out industries in Europe and the UK and reshoring them to the United States. The problem for the powers that be in Europe is that they've put themselves in between a rock and a hard place. And that's because of a deep Russophobia in part, and of course an ideological predisposition towards a view that makes it very hard at the moment for the Western European elite to think in Eurasian terms. They can't bring themselves to deal with Russia, and certainly can't bring themselves to deal with Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I think the pressures will continue to build. The pressures will build because the economic landscape is very unhealthy, and they will continue to build because the war in Ukraine is running in the wrong direction as far as the Western Europeans are concerned, and there's actually nothing that they can do to arrest the defeat that is unfolding on the battlefields of Ukraine. The nightmare for Brussels and for London is, of course, Washington taking its bat and ball and going home, and also taking whatever resources that they can lay their hands on in Europe and taking them with them. And that will cause a very radical rethink. You know, how does Brussels recalibrate itself politically, first and foremost, into a Eurasian environment in which Russia exists? Russia exists and is a strong power. It has proven itself to be a strong power. And of course, how does it recalibrate its relationship with China when for the past few years it's been talking itself into pursuing also a bunch of, get tough on China policies? If they don't start to rethink any of these issues, then the populations of individual nation states will begin to do it for them. And that's the challenge that Brussels faces. There are powerful centrifugal forces now unleashed in the Western European part of the world. We've seen that in various election results in different countries. And when the lives of ordinary people demonstrably go backwards, the quality of life and the standard of living, where real incomes go backwards and they can visibly see the degradations of the social and public infrastructure that has been part and parcel of what they considered to be their good life, when they see all of that happening, then at some point change becomes inevitable. What that change looks like really, I think, is a big open question, in part because Brussels has got to think about the cards that it wants to play now, but it means a change of direction. I saw a report today that Joseph Borrell, in one of his parting speeches, basically confessed that the European leadership has totally failed Western Europe in terms of abrogating its responsibilities to Western European sovereignty. Now, he didn't put it in those words, but in effect, that's what he did. It was a confession that Western European sovereignty has been sacrificed at the altar of transatlantic power, and Europe is now on its own.
Warwick,
that's where it's at.
Fascinating. I have two quick questions for you. One is that we bring our sessions always to the end with, which I will share with you in a minute, but I want to take you back to where we started with mBridge, and briefly, if you could kindly. At the end of the day, we live in a world that is still dependent on commodities. And Kazan Declaration as well were very much about this new commodity exchange. Do you also envision the arrival of the Glencores of the South, Global South, Terra Figuras of the South, based on capturing some of this value within the Global South, within the new monetary multi-currency architecture, tied up to that decentralized finance network? That is my question. And last but not least, talking about Joseph Borrell and the developments and the great question that Anush raised and shared with you, what would be Warwick Powell's single piece of advice in today's climate to cinephobes and cinephiles? If you were to leave them with one piece of advice, what would that be?
The commodities exchange is an important step forward, because what I think the world has realized once again, and this touches on the financialization question, which I really didn't dive into much, but it flags, once again, the critical importance of materiality in the world. The economic systems that we have are at root energy and material systems, because they are grounded in the gifts of the planet and the atmosphere in which this planet exists. We essentially, as human beings, transform energy through the consumption of food and air and water, and convert that through kinetic energy and other forms of energy via work on materials and other kinds of energy. So we capture energy to create new forms that are useful for people. So this is what actually happens in economies that satisfy the foundational requirements of human societies. In short, human societies need food for people and fuel for machines. And unless you can satisfy both of those, you won't have a functional society for much longer. What's happened historically is that as economic systems speed up their processes of capital accumulation through these processes of real economic transformations, the monetary economy actually grows faster than the ability of the real economy to validate the monetary potential. And that monetary potential ends up having to go somewhere. And human beings are incredibly inventive, and what they end up inventing is a world of fictitious capital. So we have a world in which we can now use money capital to purchase fictitious capital and trade in fictitious capital. Now, fictitious capital is a necessary part of complex, sophisticated monetary economies, because fictitious capital is a right that makes a claim on future real exchange value. And those rights can take a number of forms. They can be rights as far as an interest-bearing loan is concerned, or they can be rights as far as what equity provides you with, such as a periodic dividend, or, of course, capital value growth when you trade those equities. So we've created this world of fictitious capital. Now, fictitious capital can expand very, very quickly because it doesn't require significant energy and material transformation. It requires what is in effect legal paperwork to create. And we've seen over the last 40 years the explosion in fictitious capital and markets for that denominated in US dollars. And the issue there is that in the end, you end up with an incredibly unbalanced economic system where monetary wealth becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands who own fictitious capital, but that monetary wealth is no longer put into circulation for the development of the real exchange value-based economy. So that's that sort of problem, if you will. And the commodities exchange really firstly makes us think hard again about the importance of commodities. The second thing I think it opens up is a question rather than necessarily an answer at this point in time, and that is, how will commodities-rich nations in BRICS, so many of the world's commodities-rich nations are actually members of the so-called Global South, how do they transform the way that they are positioned globally in the way that they can participate in and capture their share of total supply chain value? So a supply chain ultimately has a total value in a monetary sense, and that total monetary value is materialized in the final price of the goods sold. That final price needs to cover the costs of that supply chain, to put it in very simple terms. So the question is a distributional one. So if the final price is 100, then all the parts along that supply chain are making a claim on that final price. If countries that are rich and abundant in natural resources become more organised, and that this exchange infrastructure enables them to become more organised and coordinated, it is conceivable that these resource-rich countries could form what is in effect the commodities version of OPEC. And that will enable them to have a greater say in the way in which their raw materials are priced and make a greater claim on the total supply chain value. So that's where I think the commodities exchange question is quite important. It dovetails too with two other important elements. One is that there is the oil and gas exchange in Shanghai, which already trades oil and gas in RMB. So we're already seeing the emergence of a non-US dollar based oil and gas exchange. And the second one is, in fact, China operates two rare earth exchanges. And again, the prices are denominated in RMB. So that's the commodities piece. As far as advices are concerned, that's always a difficult one. So that was a bit of a, that's throwing me under the bus a little bit there, but let's see how I go. In terms of both naysayers and boosters, I simply say this, that China is a big country that, like all big countries, confronts challenges as well as opportunities. The challenges that a big country faces are ones in which it necessarily needs to tackle, and that it will, as a nation, through its governments and other institutions, tackle them to the best of their abilities. What that means is that China isn't going to collapse, right? So if you have that as part of your wish casting and your frame of reference in terms of how you anticipate the world will unfold over the next so many years, well, I would strongly suggest that you recalibrate that. And all of the tropes that are rolled out sort of once every 4 to 6 weeks about some data point suggestive of impending collapse, I'd suggest you take them all with a grain of salt.
Right.
And the same advice goes to the boosters. China is going through a very substantial restructuring at the moment. And restructuring, by its very nature, is complicated and is unlikely to be perfectly coordinated and therefore perfectly smooth. Right. And so we see a very conscious effort over the last 5 years to bring the property sector to heel and at the same time seek to replace that with particularly investment demand in the new tech, high tech arena. Now, that's happening reasonably successfully, but clearly not entirely smooth either. And so there will be bumps along the way. Right. But broadly speaking, it's been relatively successful, but it's never without challenges. So I think it's important to bear in mind that China is still a developing country. It has ambitions to become a moderately prosperous society by 2035. And I think it's on its way to doing that. It's also a country that is relatively new to the table as a great power, again, is concerned, certainly in the 21st century sense. And as an emergent great power, I think it is clear that it is also trying to find its way and trying to find a set of compass points that will help it behave like a great power. And in that process, there will, of course, be episodes where it behaves in ways that, on reflection, you would say is probably not becoming of a great power. And in other occasions, it will behave in ways that exemplifies what a contemporary great power in a multinodal world looks like. And to do that, China needs to be an enabler as a great power rather than an expropriator as a great power.
Fascinating.
So basically what you're telling the world is be patient and be engaged rather than
be engaged, stay calm.
Isolationist. Be calm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Warwick, I am very envious of your students, your colleagues, your friends, and your family, because they have the privilege of having you in person with them for as often as they like. You have brought extraordinary light to our conversation, even brighter than the sun shining on my forehead here. I can't tell you how much we've enjoyed the conversation, how much I myself have learned from you. And, we always say that we'd like to have guests back. But to be honest, I think I need a 10-week course with you before I can catch up with the insights that you have. So I want to insist with Ali that we do invite you back so that we can continue to learn from you and inform our viewers of this complex world in which we live and the way in which you can shed light on all the moving parts from the individual all the way to the state and the continents. That is absolutely enlightening. So really grateful to you, Warwick, for giving us your time and sharing so much information and insight with BRI Dialogues. Much, much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Warwick. We talked about supply chain, so a chain of thank you from here all the way to Australia.
Look, I appreciate your kind words, and I'd be happy to join you again in the future.
Thank you.
Wonderful.